Let's take a look at the theory in the critical analysis of organizational communication. For many of you, the term theory is likely to send you running for cover. Theories typically seem abstract and largely inapplicable to everyday life. However, theories are actually indispensable to everyday life, and we would be unable to get along without them. At an everyday level, we operate with implicit or common sense theories that enable us to navigate the world. We do not typically subject these theories to careful reflection except in instances where they fail us in some way. For example, many people operate with the implicit theory that success is an individual thing. Achievement is due to individual abilities and hard work. This theory may be partly true, but it overlooks the fact that everyone is positioned in societies and social structures that both enable and constrain their opportunities and shape their worldview. Implicit theories tend to maintain, taken for granted, common sense understandings of the world. Common sense thinking is often uncritical, reflecting tradition and responding to the status quo. Part of the challenge of good theory, then, is to help people develop their critical communication capacities so that they can question common sense thinking and interrogate our direct experience of the world. We never really have direct access to the world around us because it's shaped by communication processes that are both the medium and expression of different institutional structure. What we think of as a direct experience is heavily rooted and mediated by these structures and institutions of power, which are difficult to transform. One of the ways that these transformations can occur is by the systematic questioning of common sense assumptions about the world through the development of critical communication capabilities and capacities in each one of us. Such capacities can be nurtured by the careful development of systematic forms of inquiry in questioning common sense. Challenge your understandings of work through the development of a critical approach to communication. While there are a number of historical influences on the critical approach, one common thread tends to run through them all. In the past 100 years or so, Karl Marx's large body of writings has profoundly influenced modern social thought. These different interpretations have in turn resulted in the establishment of different research traditions and schools of thought that expand on Marx's original ideas and attempt to make them relevant to contemporary society. Marx was witness to major economic and political upheaval in Europe as capitalism became the dominant economic and political system. Marx did not celebrate the emergence of capitalism, but rather criticized the ways in which it exploited working people. How does Marx arrive at the analysis of capitalism as an exploitative system? Let's identify some basic issues. First, Marx provides a detailed analysis of the historical development of different economic systems or forms of ownership. Marx is famous for developing a theory called historical materialism, an approach that analyzes history according to different modes of production, each involving shifting forms of property ownership and class relations. The bottom line is Marx's work has had significant limitations and it's led scholars to reverse or revise his ideas over the past 100 years. A research tradition known as cultural studies has had major impact on scholars in a wide variety of fields. Frankfurt School scholars used the term culture industry to describe the emergence and negative effects of popular culture in society, but scholars associated with cultural studies. They critique the distinction between high and low culture, arguing that such an assumption was not only elitist, but also limited the ways in which everyday culture could be conceptualized. Thus, over the past several decades, researchers in cultural studies tradition have taken everyday culture as a serious object of study, examining the complex ways in which it structures experience. One of the founders of cultural studies defines culture simply as experience lived, experience interpreted, and experience defined. In studying everyday culture, or experience then, culture studies, researchers explore the systems of shared meanings that connect members of a particular group or community. Such shared meanings are developed through systems of representation that enable communities to make sense of the world in particular ways. Systems of representation invoke not only language, spoken and written, but also clothing, music, nonverbal behaviors, space. Architects construct buildings to convey particular meanings, and so forth. Culture is examined at both an ongoing, routine, everyday practice and as a consisting of various systems of representation that enable people to collectively make meaning. In many respects, the cultural studies tradition is quite compatible with the critical approach to organizational communication. It focuses on everyday processes of sense making and identity management in the context of relations of power, and resistance fits well with how we think about work and organizational communication. Organizations are important contexts in which social actors engage with and make sense of the world. Ironically, however, the cultural studies tradition has tended to ignore work and organizations as important sites of experience lived, experience interpreted, and experience defined. We have great affinity with this work and want to bring much of its insights to the study of work and communication. The critical approach adopts a number of assumptions about organizations as communicative phenomena. In the past 30 years or so, there's been a wide acceptance of the idea that organizations are not objective structures, but rather exist as a result of the collective and coordinated communication processes of its members. Communication is not something that happens in organizations, rather, organizations come into being through communication processes. Such a position is often referred to as a social constructionist approach because its belief that language and communication do not simply reflect reality but actually create the realities in which we live. From this perspective, scholars study various forms of symbolic practice, such as storytelling, metaphors, and humor, in an attempt to understand the role they play in creating the reality that organization members experience. Not only are organizations communicatively constructed, but such construction processes are influenced by processes of power and control. In other words, organizational meanings do not simply arise spontaneously, but are shaped by the various actors and stakeholder interests. The critical approach explores the relationship between the social construction and power. We are now in a position to examine the various theories and bodies of research that make up the field of organizational communication. Armed with the analytic tools, we can begin to get grips with the history of organizational communication to make sense on how communication works in organizations today.